Welcome to Start with Hello, conversations about disability. And up to date, I think one of the most popular episodes that we've had has been episode 9. And that was one where you and I talked at length about some of the best ways that we felt we could equip disability ministry volunteers. And since it seems like this was such a topic that resonated with a lot of people, we thought, well, let's continue along that same path. And this time, could we get into just a little more detail about not just something general, like how to, in terms of training, but let's talk about some specific scenarios, stuff that we've experienced and stuff that if you're in disability ministry, chances are these are going to happen. So I just thought, let's just jump right into it. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. We got like 6 to 7 questions, and we're just going to hit the ground running. So the first one that I feel like that this is something that has happened to just about anyone who has taught a class. And I think that could be disability ministry or not. And I think everyone has encountered, or most likely will encounter, what we would call a chatterbox. What do you do when you've got someone who is in the class and this person is absolutely dominating the conversation in your classroom?
Definitely a universal problem, whether, I was in family ministry, children's ministry, then disability ministry. It happens everywhere. So definitely right about that. I would say it can be a positive and it can also be a negative. I've been in situations where there has been maybe 1 or 2 people that have their hand raised for every single question. And then the rest of the classroom either is too afraid to answer a question, raise their hand, doesn't want to participate, or just for whatever reason is quiet that day. So sometimes I don't view the chatterbox necessarily as a negative thing, but as something that is helpful and that I can lean on when I need an answer. Oftentimes, when you're in disability ministry, navigating silence is an issue. So you want to give people enough time to be able to answer questions. So you don't want to kind of fall back on relying on the chatterbox maybe to answer the question every single time. You want to give people the opportunity. So where it can become a negative is where you don't have any of that silent space when you're asking a question or you're trying to get other people involved. So what do you do? This is when it's helpful if you're meeting around tables to have a table kind of leader that is someone that can maybe sit next to the person that seems to dominate the conversations and just remind them that, hey, we want other people to have an opportunity to answer questions. So you might have someone sit next to them. You might give them something manipulative, an activity page, something like that will occupy, their time rather than them, jumping to answer every single question. You give them something else to do as well. So, yeah, I think sit somebody next to them, give them something to do before the lesson starts. Maybe you walk up to them and say, "Hey, I am so thankful that you are in this class because I know that I can always rely on you to answer a question when I have a question. But I think it's also really important that we give other people opportunities. So I want you to know ahead of time that during class, I'm only going to call on you 2 or 3 times for the entire class. So think about what 2 or 3 questions you want to answer. So you're kind of laying the groundwork beforehand and you're just letting the person know to say, hey, you're going to have 2 or 3 opportunities to answer questions today. Let them know, hey, pick which questions you want to raise your hands for. But just know that after you answer 2 or 3 questions, I'm not going to call on you. All right. And that's where you have that kind of table leader or the person sitting next to them saying, hey, you've already answered your question. So lay the groundwork, have people in place, give people something to do that can occupy kind of their time and their space. So just a few thoughts about that question.
And I also wanted to kind of piggyback off of that question, because I think this is something that will come up. I know it's come up to me a couple times, and I want to know what advice you would have for a volunteer. So you're in class, and then you have somebody who just maybe in confidence or just blurts out something that's inappropriate. And this could be like a relationship with a relative or something inappropriate that they say has happened to them outside of the classroom that they have decided that in the middle of your lesson, this is when they need to bring it up. So what advice do you have, or what steps do you think a volunteer should take should they hear something like that?
Yeah, that definitely has happened a few times in my teaching, I guess, career in disability ministry, and I think we see this sometimes because we talk often about sometimes one of the greatest things about our friends is the fact that they don't have some of the same filters that we do. And again, this can be a positive. This can be also a challenge as well, because they may just say something that happened to them in their lives right in the middle of your lesson. It may be kind of tailing with whatever the topic is of the day, or it may can be completely off the wall. And what I try to do in those situations is to not act like surprised, to not let it get me off track. And in these situations, this is where it's super important to have that person in the room, those extra volunteers in the room, whether they're table leaders or whether they're just someone in the room that's just paying attention and tracking, that can either, hey, sit down right next to the person and say, hey, that's something that you brought up that is really important that we need to talk about, but right now might not be the time to talk about that. And say, "Hey, if you wanna talk about it now, let's move to the back of the room, or let's step out into the hallway." But having that volunteer in the room that, allows that to happen, while you stay on track with your lesson. And again, don't act shocked. Don't stop the lesson. It's important what you have planned. So let's finish that. Or, if you don't have that person in the room that can kind of take care of, the situation that's come up, you just make this a statement as you're teaching. Just say, "Hey, I want you to know that I heard what you said. We're going to talk about this later when we finish our lesson." Let them know that you heard them, and promise that you're gonna follow up on that. If it is something that is, it has triggered, you as a leader to say, "Oh my goodness, this is potentially abuse or neglect that needs to be followed up on." We have a great resource that's just called "What to Do When You Suspect Abuse or Neglect," and, man, I would have that resource handy at all times when I'm leading, because these situations will come up, and this will walk you through what to do exactly in those situations. And that could be a whole podcast episode. So I would just refer you to that resource. But yeah, as a leader, stay on track. Have someone in the room that can redirect and help in the moment, or just promise that you've heard them, and promise that you'll follow up as soon as the lesson is over. This is not something that you wait till next week to address. These are things that are hot potato issues that need to be handled within the first 24 hours.
That's why I like that we're talking about these things. I think that when I first got into teaching, there was a part of me that thought, okay, I know anything can happen, but you kind of feel like you're not really ready for everything that will happen. And when you said you got to try to not act surprised, I think that can come with practice. That's hard at first. There's been so many times where you're right in the middle of something and you're thinking about maybe the next slide or the next point or the next part of class, and somebody stands up or from their seat, they say something, and it could entirely shift the direction of everything if you're not ready. That's a really important thing to talk about. So I'm glad that we're bringing this up, because it's better to hear about it here and to be mindful that that could happen, rather than find yourself in the hot seat and responding the wrong way. The next question that I wanted to ask, and again, I think these are all pretty common, and if you haven't experienced it, I just see this coming, and that's the aggressive person. So you've got somebody who's a regular, and maybe he or she has been known to be aggressive with others in class. That could be a variety of things, like just being closer to other people who don't like their personal space being involved. Maybe they're trying to hold hands with the women in class. The general behavior of this person, he or she has been known to make maybe like one particular student uncomfortable, so much so that the other family's like, well, we can't come to church. So how do you handle something like this? You've got the overly aggressive person, and I guess it's hard to pinpoint it because I think there's like a variety of contexts, but for this question, I'm just thinking like just overly aggressive.
Yeah, and I think almost all of my answers so far, and maybe to come, the best answer has to do with having enough volunteers in the room to help you. Because if you're leading from the front, if you're teaching, you don't have the ability to run interference on this. So you need to have enough volunteers in the room that can help. If you've got a situation like this where someone's targeting someone else in the class, whether it be something they're kind of obsessed with this person, whether it be at a friendship level, romantic level, you need to have that person that can sit next to the person that is feeling attacked, so they can serve as a physical barrier to keep the other person away. If you're in a smaller classroom, this is even more difficult to deal with, but having that person that can kind of protect that person and run interference is super important. If you're in a larger classroom, this is something that you can more easily deal with. And typically, you don't like to have to do assigned seats for anyone, but in this situation, you can sit one person in one corner of the room and have the other person say, "Hey, we're going to sit in this area today," and you say, "Hey, I want you to pick what seat you want to sit at this table." So again, you're not saying, "Hey, you have to sit here." You're giving them a choice. Say, "Hey, I'd love for you to sit at any seat you want at this table, and I'm going to sit with you today." So you're having that person that can again run interference, be that physical barrier for someone. You also want to give the person that's feeling targeted options. Say, "Hey, if this is too much, if you're just not comfortable, say, hey, I'd love to take a walk with you." So again, it's dependent on having enough volunteers in the room, but just say, "Hey, give me a signal if you need to take a walk, and I'll go with you." So having that person to help them out is important. I think it's important too to have that conversation, whether it's outside of class or it's during class with the person, to help them understand how they're making other people feel. Just saying, "Hey, when you do this, it makes other people feel." I think we need to build awareness with people and saying, "Hey, this behavior, you may not mean it to come across this way, but it is coming across this way, and it's stopping you from being able to be friends with this person that you desperately want to be friends with. So, how can we act a little differently?" So, you want to do education, you want to do interference, you want to have people have an escape plan, because you don't want to ever get to the point where someone says, "I'm not going to come to church because of this person and their behaviors." So a lot of different things you can do there. The most important thing though is to having volunteers that can run interference for you, because if it's you that's managing the entire thing, the one thing that definitely won't happen is a lesson being taught if you have to run interference yourself as a leader.
I was thinking about a specific scenario that I had last year where we had somebody come into the class and we were told by the parents that this person in particular, for some reason or another, liked to target those with Down syndrome. And I'd never run into that before, where it was like just something about that diagnosis that they would pick on them. And, so we're letting the volunteers know. And when I had another conversation with the parent after class, I said, well, they got really comfortable because they wanted to come up and smell my ear. And once you're in disability ministry, I think you learn a little bit more about boundaries and how they don't really care about boundaries. Some do. And I thought that she was just comfortable. And the parent said, well, she was getting too comfortable because had she done it even more, she would have been biting your ear. And I had no idea. So if you've got a moment to talk to the parents, because I've seen some instances where volunteers come in and go right to the room, they don't have any of that interaction with the parents. So if you've got somebody that could just have like a quick chat and pass along that information and just say, hey, just to kind of watch and keep them separate because that person likes to go after this kind of person. And if they start smelling your ear, kind of back up. So I think some of those things are kind of helpful. I know it's always hard to, you don't always, everybody doesn't get a chance to have a long-term conversation or read the intake sheet, but just something to get that information and pass it along to the volunteers.
I think in these situations, it's not a surprise typically to the person that's being aggressive. They've probably got a track history of this. They've probably been told no in other arenas. For example, we had an issue. An individual in our ministry was really infatuated with one of our volunteers and would continually go up to her and say, "Do you love me? Do you love me?" And it was just it was like a record on skip that was the only track. "Do you love me? Do you love me?" And it got to the point where, the female volunteer just got really uncomfortable with it, and the female volunteer came up to the ministry leader and said, "Hey, this is going on. Can you help?" And the ministry leader goes up to the individual and instantly gets defensive. He's like, "Don't tell mom, don't tell mom," because he know like this is an issue. It's not a surprise, so don't be afraid to address it, because these are things that are having to be dealt with in other arenas of life, not named church, and there probably are. There are ways that parents deal with it. There are ways that people at work or school deal with it. So don't be afraid to address it. There's probably a way that it is best dealt with, and people want to be on the same page. So once you address it, you're much better off, and you've got a chance to intercede and hopefully stop some of these unwanted behaviors in your ministry.
That's a really good point. That resonates with me. Every time that we've had a chat with parents, you're right. They're aware of it. And it's so important for us to talk about it because a lot of times the parents are working on it. And if we at the church can do the same thing that's being reinforced at home, I think that helps that we're hearing a consistent message at home and at church and at school and all of these places. And it just makes everybody a little bit more comfortable in, the boundaries that we're setting. But to kind of stay on the topic of those that are a little bit more aggressive, I want to go a little bit further than that to where you feel like you've reached a point with somebody who has become so aggressive that now we're concerned with safety. And I think that could look a lot of different ways. My question to you is how do you determine where that line is? Number one, of where, okay, I'm safe, but now I'm not, or don't feel safe. And what happens in that situation? Like, what can you do as a volunteer where now you're questioning that? Like, hey, this person is doing this activity or whatever it is. I no longer feel like I'm safe. How do you handle that?
Number one, it's got to be handled directly with the parent, the caregiver, the guardian, the staff member. Again, this is probably not a new behavior. This is probably happening outside of church too. So there's probably a treatment plan. So you want to be as consistent as possible. Do things that are successful outside of church. But if it's just not working, and it gets to a point, again, this can't be a surprise to the parent, caregiver, staff member. It can't come out of nowhere. So, like, if you're noticing something, you're bringing it up. Don't be afraid to have that conversation when the parent caregiver comes to pick up the individual. You got to let them know how it's going because when they come up and they ask you, "Hey, how did things go today?" And you're like, "Oh, it was great." And you're putting on that brave smile on your face. You're doing a disservice to the individual, to the parent, the caregiver, and to yourself. Be honest and say, "Hey, we love having so and so in our ministry, but we noticed a few things that we wish we could have help with." You always want to start with a positive, and then you want to bring it in the issue. So make sure you're addressing it. Don't let it come out of left field for the parent. And when you just come to the point where you say, "Hey, this can't continue. Your son or your daughter, it can't come back." Like it should never ever come to that point. Let me give you one specific example from my time in ministry. We had an individual that kind of grew up in kind of the kids side of the ministry, but didn't want to transition to the adult ministry at the time where he should have transitioned into that ministry. Just felt comfortable Volunteers were comfortable with him. It was a good fit. And nobody wanted to force that move. We got to the point where we were seeing some of these, aggressive behaviors. And it got to the point where other people weren't safe. And I think, where's the line? It's where safety comes in place. When we had an incident where this individual, he loved his music, and he always had to have his music, so he brought his boombox, he brought his CDs, and that's what helped him. And we loved the fact that he was able to use those to keep him in the environment. But one Sunday just wasn't working, and he started throwing not only the CDs but the boombox. And when you've got younger children in that space, obviously it became a situation where it was no longer safe. And so this again wasn't new to the parents when we were talking about this, but we just said, hey, we'd love to have so and so make that transition into the adult ministry, but for whatever reason, that wasn't happening. And we said, okay, we're never going to say that you're not welcome at church. Here's what we'd like to do. We'd like to have somebody that is assigned as a walk along. Your son can go anywhere he'd like in the church. He can go in the cafe, go into service, go into the adult ministry, but he's going to have somebody that's a friend with him that's going to walk alongside with him, just to make sure that he's safe, because we want you to know that there's always a place here. And again, this comes down to, do you have enough ministry volunteers to be able to assign somebody as a walk along that allows them to be in the building, while the parents, the family are in the building. So yeah, the line always is, the safety of the other individuals in the room. You got to protect that, because if you don't, you've got other situations that you've got on hand that you've got to deal with, and people will start leaving, not coming back. So you want to keep everybody in the building, but you got to make it safe for everybody.
Speaking of keeping everybody in the building, I think this one is another commonly seen one. I think you worded it as everybody's nightmare, and that's the runner. So what do you do when you have someone who is a quote unquote runner in your ministry?
How about you give me an easy question?
That was easy. Is there an easy question? Is there such a thing as an easy question?
I don't know. But no, this is a tough one. Like, everybody's nightmare situation is losing a child, whether it's a runner or whether it's just somebody got lost in the mix. I've had those, 20 plus years in ministry. I've had one or two situations where at the end of the day, we're checking out kids, matching them up with parents, and a parent comes and child's not in a room. And like, that is the absolute nightmare situation that everybody wants to avoid. Luckily, every time, we've found the child somewhere, or they've been picked up by, a sibling or somebody, and they didn't check out properly, and we didn't know that they left the room. So the situations like that are different. But when you know that you've got a runner, the parents check them in, just say, hey, he's got a history of taking off. That obviously puts every volunteer on edge. It doesn't have to if everybody's prepared for that situation. The first thing that I would say, we've got a great resource for that. We have an emergency form that has a picture ID, name, contact information, how to communicate, how to de-escalate. If you've got a runner, you have got to have one of these emergency forms filled out. There's not only one in the room, but there's a copy with your security team, with your facilities team. If you have, larger churches, will have different police that will help with either traffic or just being a presence. They've got a copy. So, so you can get on the radio and say, so and so has escaped. So you immediately know what that child or individual looks like, and you have strategies to help in those situations. But let's talk about what you can do to prevent them from escaping, right? You've got the plan in place for when they escape to get people on alert, but let's talk about keeping them in the room. I think the first thing that you do is, again, volunteer dependent, is making sure you've got an extra person that can be assigned to that child. You want to make sure that you've got eyes on them at all times. You want to make sure that you're extra welcoming. You obviously you want to be welcoming to everybody, but you want to make sure that the child feels safe, that feels welcomed. So you want to go out of your way to do that. Assign them a buddy. Make sure you know how they're feeling that day. We've got a great resource called "How Are You Feeling?" The "How Are You Feeling?" kind of picture chart. So get a kind of pulse on the kid to see what's going on. Sometimes I think people run because either they're anxious about the situation, they're irritated, by something, or sometimes they're just bored and they want to test, they want to test their environment. So you want to make sure that they're not bored, right? They have enough to keep them busy, whether that be through activity pages, things that they enjoy doing. Putting them in charge of things is a great way to keep them from wanting to escape is by giving ability, making them feel important, making them feel like they're a leader in the room, giving them jobs to do is a great thing to do. When you've got the buddy with them, obviously, the buddy should always position themselves physically between the child and the door, right? That becomes that obstacle, that barrier. In some situations, churches I've seen will take a physical door and cut it in half so the top part can be open, so you can see in and out, so there's no issues, and the bottom part can be kinda locked shut, so it is a physical barrier. I've seen other churches that will place kind of like an adjustable room divider that they'll place in front of the door. Sometimes this becomes an issue of like safety and can you get out of the room? If there's a fire situation, you don't want to have something that you can't get out of. But having that obstacle between the child and the door, whether that be a physical object or whether that be a volunteer, positioning them on the opposite side of the room from the door. Again, you're managing that physical space. You're giving them a buddy. You're putting them in charge of things. You're keeping eye contact with the child so you can kind of judge kind of how things are going as you're leading from the front. If you're seeing that the child is overstimulated, you want to make sure that you can kind of redirect them, give them an opportunity to, cool down, whether it's a sensory bag or again, just the friend that's with them to redirect them. Again, keeping a pulse on the situation and just making sure that the child feels comfortable, accepted, and empowered to be a leader. It's easy. Well, I won't say it's easy. It's easier if the child enters the room and is there for the entire time and then never leaves. But we know in a lot of ministries, especially in the area of children and youth, you may be in one space for the opening part of your session, and you may travel from like a small group space to a large group space and back again. So it's those travel times when things get, extra anxious. That's when you have that person walking with them. You're going to place the child in a line of people. You're not going to put them necessarily at the front or the end because it's easier to take off. So you want, again, thinking of barriers, you want to place them where there's lots of people around. When you're moving from space to space, obviously you probably have security people in the hallways, and those are the times where you say, "Hey, let's keep an extra eye on so and so today." Not that you're going to be hovering over them, but you want to have them aware that say, "Hey, we transition from small group to large group during this times. Can we make sure to have a security person in the hallway at those times?" So just want to think through everything, and it's manageable, it's doable. Again, it's not these situations are never surprises to parents or caregivers. They obviously probably have plans in place at school and other environments. So be aware of those plans and try to institute as much stuff in the church environment as possible.
The other scenario I wanted to throw out at you. So you've got somebody in disability ministry, they're a volunteer, and they're having a conversation with someone at the church, could be in their community, and they hear something that goes along the lines of this: well, you don't really need a disability ministry anyway. God gives everybody with a disability a free pass to heaven. So for a new volunteer, I think this could be overwhelming. And I'm so glad that I never had to have this statement made to me when I first started, because I feel like it would have I would have been really intimidated by this, and I could see somebody being overwhelmed or frustrated and maybe angry. How do you equip churches or staff, volunteers? How do you equip people to be prepared to handle a statement or a question like that?
I've actually heard this before, and in this situation, like the first time I heard it, it took me by surprise so much that I didn't really even know what to say, until I had like a few minutes to think about it. The simple response is, show me in scripture where anybody gets a free pass to heaven. Like that's the simple response. Obviously, it doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a free pass to heaven in scripture. There's no asterisks in scripture that says, that there is, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one, comes to the Father except for through him, unless you have an intellectual developmental disability because God feels sorry for you and lets you in for free. I've never found that scripture. So the simple answer is show me in scripture. Now, obviously, most volunteers are probably not feeling to the point where they're comfortable enough to spar with somebody and exchange scriptures with them. That's one of the reasons why we created the document, the resource called "What Does the Bible Really Say About Disability?" So again, if you have that on hand, that's a great tool to be able to engage with people on the level of scripture. What does the Bible really say about people with disabilities? And we address the fact that all people need Jesus, and that includes people with disabilities, with intellectual developmental disabilities. So make sure that you have that resource handy. Make sure you remind people that all people need Jesus and that all people have a level of understanding of that and have an opportunity to respond to that. So yeah, I would just say, hey, make sure have that resource. Another great resource that we have is our baptism decision workbook that's available in just about every different accessible format you could ever imagine. So again, having that handy as well, just to show people that, there is a process for all people. And that entrance into heaven is because of the grace of Jesus and our response to that. So equip people with the knowledge and the truth. But yeah, it's intimidating when you get thrown that question for the first time.
You mentioned baptism, so I wanted to mention this. I kind of wanted to tackle this next one in two parts. Obviously, we want to talk about first about baptism in general. So you've got somebody in your class and they've expressed interest in baptism or maybe just a general curiosity. What steps should staff and volunteers take from that point? After you answer that, I've got a piggyback off of that one. So I guess like I said, the first question is, what do you do? How do you make sure somebody knows the decision that they're making?
Again, I think it's having that resource, the baptism decision workbook. It's not anybody that comes to me in ministry and says, "Hey, I really want to give my life to Jesus. I've heard about this baptism thing. I'm interested." You want to sit down and have that conversation with them, not only with them, but with a parent, with a caregiver, with a staff member, and just say, "Hey, so and so has mentioned they're interested in becoming baptized. They want to give their heart to Jesus. We have this great resource called the Baptism Decision Workbook. We take this decision seriously, and we want to make sure everybody understands exactly what they're getting into. So, would you be willing to work through this process with so and so?" We always want to make sure that people are doing the work, understand what they're getting into, and doing that with a parent, a caregiver, or a staff member, or a pastor is a really important part of the process because a lot of people will make a decision, based on emotion in the moment, and those decisions aren't bad. But if you do make those decisions, you do jump in the baptistry. I'd follow it up with the baptism decision workbook and help them say, "Hey, I love the fact that you're passionate about following Jesus and you don't want anything to stand in your way and you just want to jump right in the baptistry and get baptized. But make sure we're all on the same page and understanding what this is all about. So let's work through this workbook together and let's celebrate this decision together."
I personally like the workbook because when I first started volunteering, there's a lot of reasons that you can be intimidated, and I think one of them is you worry that I don't have the answers to everything. Somebody's going to come up and ask me something, and I'm not going to know what to do or how to handle it or what to say. You know, if somebody approaches you and they have a question about baptism and you're a brand new volunteer, that can be intimidating. And that's why I love this baptism decision workbook. It takes all that guesswork out. And, you know, we're also working on beyond baptism. So what to do after that, which I think will take a lot of guesswork out. And I would encourage any volunteer listening, if you're brand new and these things sound intimidating, like, I don't know what I would do if somebody said that. You're more than likely working with somebody on staff. The staff at our church is fantastic. I feel like I don't absolutely have to know all the answers. Collectively as a team, I feel like we can get it done. And that's great that I have that fallback. It's taken a lot of pressure off of me, but having a lot of these resources handy has been really helpful. And it kind of leads me to another question though. So let's say we've got the baptism decision workbook, or let's say we're dealing with a baptism scenario. What if somebody is nonverbal? Do we not baptize them because they can't give a verbal confession of faith? Like, how does that work, and how has that worked for you in the past?
I've run into this, and I've heard opposition say, "Hey, you can't be baptized unless you give a verbal confession of faith." And again, my response is, why do your words have to, why do your words have to be coming out of your mouth? Why can't you use words with your fingers if you're using sign language? Why can't your words come from a communication device if you use a communication device? Why can't your words come from pointing to a visual communication card? That's another resource that we have that ministries can download and use that have, the yes, no answers, along with a ton of other different ways that people communicate in the church environment. So I would encourage everybody, download that visual communication card, have that handy in your ministry. If you have an individual that is either nonverbal or chooses not to use words, so have that handy so that you can engage people in conversations. There's so many different ways that people communicate rather than using words that come out of your mouth. There is no reason why someone should be stopped from being baptized just because they don't use words verbally. There are so many different forms of communication, and I think we need to embrace all of them, because not all of us use verbal words.
You don't have to answer this one if you don't want to. This is just started thinking about this when you were talking about it's one thing, those affected by disability, if they face so many different challenges just getting into the building itself and being included, being embraced. And baptism shouldn't be an obstacle. Can you think of any scenario that would stop somebody from being baptized?
If they refuse to acknowledge the fact that they are a sinner and in need of Jesus, that would be one thing, but that wouldn't be specific to somebody with just a disability. But you gotta acknowledge the fact that you need Jesus. But yeah, so long as you do that, there should be no reason to stop somebody from being baptized. And
it's like you might have people. I think we dealt with this once, right? There was somebody who could not be immersed,
right?
Or maybe they have a terrifying fear of water.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some people, well, like if you can't give a verbal confession, we can't baptize you. Well, you've got to be immersed. So then what?
I think there's always different circumstances that you can and should work around in those situations. The one barrier that should never stand in the way of someone giving their life to Jesus and being baptized is another person. That's the one barrier that cannot exist. I mean, can you imagine making it to heaven or not making it to heaven because you wouldn't allow someone else access to heaven? Like, the person should never be that barrier.
Yeah, we're supposed to be conduits, right? Like if we're at church, aren't we supposed to help facilitate this process?
Exactly. And you look to scripture, the thief on the cross, next to Jesus. There's two of them, right? There was one that was ridiculing Jesus and making fun of Jesus and telling him, why can't you save yourself if you're the Messiah? And then there was the other thief on the other side of Jesus that stood up for Jesus. Did that thief get taken down off the cross and baptized before he died? No, he didn't. The very fact that he stood up for Jesus, claimed his faith in Jesus on the cross, was good enough for Jesus. Obviously, baptism is super, super important. It is a command in the Bible. It is something that Jesus himself set the example on. He was the only person in history that didn't need to be baptized, yet he chose to be baptized because he wanted to set the example of the importance of baptism. That said, the thief on the cross next to him wasn't baptized, and he made it to heaven. So if there are situations where medically someone cannot be submersed, someone is deathly afraid of water, there are situations where they can be sprinkled. Somebody can't give the verbal confession, but they can sign, or they can point, or they can use a communication device. There are exceptions. Obviously, you can profess your faith in Jesus, be saved. And the only obstacle that cannot exist in stopping somebody from getting to that point is another person. That's the only thing that I can say is not allowed.
Well, I think that's a pretty good spot to wrap the episode up. And I also think that's a pretty good segue into the next episode. And what we have on deck is we're going to sit down and chat with Gary Spangler, who wrote a book, Does God Really Love Everyone? And we're going to go into a little bit more detail about that book, what it really means to Gary, and how all of that came about. If you haven't done so already, we would love it if you subscribed or followed the podcast or just dropped us a rating. It would mean a great deal to our ministry. So until next time. On February 2nd, 22 Day, as it would become known, something unthinkable happened. All of the toilets in public restrooms everywhere mysteriously shrank to miniature size. Tale of the Shrinking Toilets documents the worldwide mass chaos that ensued. Written by Ryan Wolf and illustrated by Adam Bryant, the tale of the Shrinking Toilets book reveals the devastating consequences of an inaccessible world and spins a powerful allegory revealing a hidden epidemic, inviting readers to be change agents. Learn more and get involved by visiting shrinkingtoilets.com.